Well, welcome everybody to the latest episode of Port Perspectives. I'm Captain Jeff Monroe, and I am the Director of Educational Programs for the International Association of Maritime and Port Executives. And this is an ongoing series of programs where we've been talking to senior executives and people who've had long and successful careers in the maritime industry and in some cases the U.S. Coast Guard, which leads me to our distinguished guest today. And that is Admiral Rick Larrabee, who he and I go back a number of years, back to the 1980s when he was a captain of the port in New York, and I was the interim Marine Trans Department director at Fort Schuyler. And Rick, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And a disclaimer, Rick is on our board of advisors for the IAMPE, but that's not why I'm talking to him today. It's because of the distinguished career that he's had over the time. So welcome aboard, Rick. It's great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, let's begin with something nice and simple. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Go back a ways, spent most of my professional career in the Coast Guard. After graduating from the Academy in 1967, went to sea, got involved eventually after graduate school with the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Program, became a Marine inspector, did most of the things that that discipline requires. Spent most of my time initially in Hampton Roads, and then went on to be commanding officer of the Marine Safety Office in Detroit. Was in Coast Guard headquarters as the program manager for oil and hazardous chemicals spill response. Spent some time as captain of the port of New York, as you mentioned. Was the assistant superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy for a year. Great tour. Got selected for flag. Was head of the Coast Guard Reserve Program and training, and then finally was the first district commander, where I spent the last couple of years of my career. And after retired from the Coast Guard in 2000, was fortunate enough to be able to join the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Became the port director there in 2000, the end of 2000, and served in that role for about 15 years and retired in 2015. Since then, I've sort of stayed a little bit involved with the industry. I'm on a number of boards, including this one. So I've got some recency, but I feel like things have changed an awful lot in the 8 years that I've been gone. So I'm happy to talk about my career, though, and some of the things that I think might help some other people.
Well, you faced some interesting challenges, I think, in the course of your time, both in the Coast Guard and certainly in the Port of New York. You dealt with the aspect of the Kennedy loss and when John Jr. died in 1999, and that plane was lost. And also the Egyptian Air Flight 990 in November of that year, which I thought was interesting. I remember seeing you on TV and how well you handled the various aspects of all the things that were going on around that, right? Including all the politicians who stepped up, who always had some comment to say and everything like that. And it seemed that you had gotten pretty good control over the whole thing. And then, of course, you were in the World Trade Center and on 9/11, and everybody thought you were dead, and you kind of popped up and surprised everybody. So, but tell us a little bit about how you faced some of those challenges, Rick.
Yeah, I mean, it's just you reviewing some of those things brings back some interesting memories. But I think from my perspective, the Coast Guard, from the time I was a cadet through my career, kind of prepared you. This idea that the Coast Guard is always ready. It sounds like sort of a trite motto, but the reality is you develop a mindset that says at any given time, something could happen, and the likelihood is that whatever happens, it wasn't something that you prepared for. And I think when you develop that sort of an outlook on life, you are constantly sort of assessing what's going on around me. What do I need to be paying attention to? And I think from my perspective, the takeaway from all of those events that you might have talked about is a simple fact that when you're in a job, particularly as it relates to both the Coast Guard and then later on at the Port Authority, you don't do anything by yourself. And you quickly realize that you're a part of a team, But that team has extensions and the need to reach out to others and be part of a much larger team. So whether it was in the Coast Guard in dealing with the JFK Jr. incident, which involved 43 different federal, state, and local agencies, whether it was 9/11 or some of the other things that went on at the Port Authority, we were constantly reaching out and creating personal relationships with other organizations, with the people in those organizations, developing what I would call trust. The idea that you not only are competent in what you do, but you do what you say and you have integrity. And those kinds of relationships ultimately are the most critical part of that sort of a situation. Because at any one time, at least in the jobs that I had, we were always relying on somebody else to get involved. So I think that, to me, that's the major takeaway for dealing with some of these things.
Yeah, it's kind of very evident now that we see what's going on in Baltimore, how many agencies have sort of come together and everybody's working together. The Coast Guard, obviously the Army Corps, the state DOTs and everything, trying to deal with the aspects of what's happening with the bridge removal and the ship itself and what happened. And of course, they're still speculating on exactly what the issue was. But, at the end of the day, I suspect it's going to produce a whole pile of new regulations. And I seem to think that, looking back, of course, on 9/11, when we had two of the terrorists come through Portland, you're absolutely right. It's really a team effort, because you think to yourself, well, instinctively, you've got to react to something, right? And then you recognize that you're surrounded by good people if you've cultivated a team. And I think that's probably one of the most important things. Also, this interagency things, the whole aspect of the fact that we in the port industry are not in this alone. We have to work with our DOTs. We have to work with the federal agencies. We have to work with our waterway people. All of these folks are all key components of our, certainly key components of what we try to get accomplished. And I think that anytime port authorities or port authority directors find themselves in isolation, whether it's internally or externally, that's when they're least successful. When you got to the Port Authority, that was a whole different world for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what were your expectations and what were the realities in all of that?
So I was fortunate enough to get the assistant director's job. I worked for Lillian Barone, who had a great career at the Port Authority and certainly learned a lot from her. But I had come from having been the captain of the Port of New York and New Jersey for 3 years in the early 90s. And I thought I knew all of the people in the port. I had been the district commander, so New York was still part of my area of responsibility. So I thought I knew the people. I thought I knew the port pretty well. I thought I knew the Port Authority. And after about a week of being in the job, I woke up one morning in a cold sweat, realizing I really didn't know much about the port industry, or not as much as I needed to know. And it was a 15-year learning experience for me. And fortunately, the people around me were good enough to sort of help me through some of that early process, because it really was different. And an example of that was that in the Coast Guard, we never had any money, and you never solved a problem that required money. But in the Port Authority in those days, prior to 9/11, we solved a lot of problems by just throwing money at it. And that didn't work after a while, but it was interesting to me. The other part of it was that although I thought I came from a political world, I had no idea what full contact politics was all about. And I got to the Port Authority in 2000. We had just gone through an 18-month period when the two states weren't talking to each other and the board wasn't meeting over an event in the port. Somebody getting a better deal than somebody else, because the two states were sort of rivals in those days and probably still are. And so it became very obvious to me when at a meeting one day, somebody in the meeting, and this is with our executive director, Bob Boyle, somebody said, politics aside, And Boyle stood up, and I thought he was going to stand on the desk. And he said, just remember, you can't put politics out of anything that we do. And that was the case. There was no question about it. There was always a political agenda in place. And when you recognize that in a port like New York, where you had so many legitimate agendas that were not necessarily always aligned with each other, the job became much clearer to me that it was going to be a challenge to try and find solutions that other people would sort of buy into.
Well, you and I come from an environment where, as you know, in senior positions, me in the maritime industry, you in the Coast Guard, you could just snap your fingers and people would jump,
Right.
And very different though in the port industry. You have all of a sudden you have to persuade people, and I often found that that was a very challenging skill set to develop. We were the same way in Boston. We considered politics a contact sport up there as well. And so the reality is as senior managers and executives, you have to learn the art of politics. Is there a way to develop those skills, do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, you could spend the rest of the day talking about the skills necessary to do that. I mean, it's all about listening. It's all about understanding the agenda that somebody else in the room has, and understanding where you can find compromise, because an awful lot of what we did was ultimately as a result of compromise. When you decide you want to raise the Bayonne Bridge because that's a good thing, there are a community of people out there who don't see it the same way. And the idea that if you raise the bridge, you're going to bring more cargo, and more cargo brings more congestion, more air quality problems, and those kinds of things. And you quickly have to realize that if you're not paying attention to those things from the beginning, you're going to wind up being tripped as the process unfolds.
Yeah, I remember that project. And in fact, I did the navigation study for that project, which was quite interesting. One of the things I suggested to your staff, I says, well, what do we need a bridge going between Staten Island and Bayonne for? And I thought they were all going to grab their chest, when I said that. So,
well, it wasn't, and in that case, it wasn't necessarily because they needed a bridge to move cars. It was the iconic symbol of the community of Bayonne, and they were not about to see that bridge taken down for any reason.
Yeah, it was a national engineering landmark, if I remember correctly, way back when. And you have cultivated a lot of people. The current director of the port, Beth Rooney, was one of your, I think, followers very closely. And she was one of my students at Fort Schuyler. And it's hard to believe that so many of these students who have come up through the industry, who I taught as undergraduates, have made it to successful places. But she always credited you with a great deal of mentorship and helping her to understand, the kind of the nuances. And of course, she has the job now that you used to have, which has been great. She's been very successful in that, and much to your credit of mentoring, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of mentoring, and again, another topic that we could go into in a lot more detail, but I do think the idea of mentoring is clearly a responsibility of senior people in any organization. And I think in the case of Beth Rooney, I'll just give you one example. On the 12th of September of 2001, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Beth walked into my temporary office in Port Newark and said, "Hey, boss, I'm here. What can I do?" And I said to her, "Beth, what do you know about port security?" Now, up until that point, as you well know, Jeff, port security was about cars getting stolen or containers getting opened. And all of a sudden, we were faced with this idea that that container ship with a couple of thousand boxes on it could be used as a weapon by a terrorist. And we're not going to let it into, or we have some assurances that it's not. The idea of port security changed instantaneously. And Beth Rooney took that responsibility on, worked with captain of the port. We developed procedures for bringing ships into the port. Ultimately, we worked with the federal government to develop the new regulations governing port security. And Beth was right at the ground floor of it. The idea that as a junior member of an organization, be it the Coast Guard or a port, you're willing to do just about anything. The idea that I'll take on the responsibility, recognizing that I may not be the expert, but I'll work my ass off to become a valued employee, I think is the key. Now, I know the world's changed. I know people don't go to work every day these days, but the reality is that I still think that if you're not there face to face every day and you're not demonstrating your value and having that informal exchange all the time, you're putting yourself at great risk.
Mhm. We've been very lucky that we've had now over 130 Coast Guard officers who have taken our Maritime Port Executive Program and continue to do so. And I always kid them. I says, they're either shooting for flag or they're looking for something to do afterwards. I think that one of the things that has been very helpful to our Coast Guard folks is that they have a much broader understanding of the challenges that we face in the port industry, just the challenges of commerce and business development, things like that. What advice would you give young Coast Guard officers, whether they are hoping to be flag or whether they're hoping to someday find another avenue in the industry? What advice would you give them?
I mean, I think it goes along the same lines as I described Beth's, initial sort of ability to step up when the time was right. You got to look for opportunities, and you got to be willing to do some things that maybe are not the most glorious things in the world. The idea of sort of starting at the bottom. As a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard, I made the decision to get more heavily involved with the Marine Safety Program. And I followed a warrant officer around for 2 years in a shipyard, learning that business. And it didn't bother me in the least. We both had the same set of coveralls on. Neither one of us saluted to each other in the morning. And I learned a great deal from that warrant officer. Same thing on my first ship. The chief quartermaster on my ship, Chief Chase, taught me more about navigation than I ever learned when I was in classrooms at the academy. So the idea that you can learn from other people, no matter where they are, keep your eyes and your ears open and your mouth shut at times. It helps an awful lot. And I
remember an old professor once told us, said a successful candidate is one who's willing to learn something they already know.
Well, there you go.
Which is always a true factor. So as you know, we have a lot of young people coming into the industry now, and we're very pleased to see how many women are now in senior positions throughout the industry. And which, of course, when I first started teaching this course 15 years ago, it was, mostly guys that look like you and me. Right. And now we see a lot more women in the program and stuff, and people internationally from all over the world who are taking the programs, which is great because it's the only worldwide international standard for certification of port professionals. But if you're a young person coming in, and I guess, what you've said, I know certainly would apply to that. But if I'm just a young person starting in my career, what's the best advice you could give them as a potential mentor in regards to setting a path ahead of them and how to get there?
I think in general, whether you're in the military, in the Coast Guard or the Navy, or whether you're in the port industry in some aspect, I think generally the people around you are people that want to help you. If you are demonstrating kinds of characteristics that you and I just talked about, then people will reach out to help you. And I always found out that, you could help yourself by when somebody says to you, Jeff, what do you want to do in life? And you have at least an idea, that 30-second elevator speech, the actual response may never be, well, I know exactly what you need to help yourself. But they'll always come back with, well, that's a good idea, but here's another idea. And people are willing, I think, to help you along and from that perspective. I mean, I will tell you that at least, again, in my own case, the idea of going to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was not one of my initial thoughts after leaving the Coast Guard. And it was Linda O'Leary, a name that you may remember, who was in the tug and barge industry, who called me on the phone one day and said, hey, Rick, there's this job opening at the Port Authority and you might be interested in it. That's the kind of thing that, for me at least, it was always the ability to communicate with others and keep people with the idea that, hey, I'm looking for something, and here's kind of what I'm looking for. And they may have an idea that sets you off in a little bit different direction, but it becomes the path that you wind up taking.
You know, it's kind of funny. We have a brigadier general who actually is also the director of all the ports for one of the inland river system, who teaches our inland program. And he pretty much sounds the same way. When he's teaching the course, he talks a great deal about, you know, being able to adapt, you know, being able to plan, but also being flexible enough to adjust your course at any time. You know, and as I look back at myself, you know, I started off as a boat driver, you know, then I became a professor, you know, and then I went on to, you know, the deputy director up in Boston, then the director up in Portland. And I remember the first time the airport manager introduced me to all the station managers. And they said to me, you know, oh, Capt Monroe, he says, what type of planes do you fly? And I go like, well, you know, 7.2, 7.4, 7. He says, wow, you're qualified for all that? And I go like, no, I just buy the ticket and sit in the back. You know? So what's a boat guy doing running an airport? But it's amazing how you have to have the courage, I think, to take on the challenge, and, you know, depend on the people who work around you and work with you, because I always found that I was never the smartest guy in the room. And that was always, I think, very important, to recognize the people that do work for you and to highlight their strengths, encourage them to overcome their weaknesses, and in essence, always to be flexible, adaptable. We make plans and then life occurs. And as both of us know, you know, that's the changes that we face. Be prepared for just about anything.
Yeah, and I think as you talked about that, the other key to this is, particularly for people who are in senior leadership positions who have people working for them, you have to let people have the flexibility to fail once in a while. And I think, again, another example, the first commanding officer of the first Coast Guard cutter that I was on, the Casco out of Boston, the CO was a guy named Bernie Thompson. And Bernie's philosophy was, if you had the watch, you were going to have the con. And therefore, if the ship's getting underway, you're going to get it underway as an ensign. If we're going into port, you're taking it into port. If we're going through a rough patch, you're gonna keep it. He stood behind you, and he may have made a couple of minor edits, but he never criticized and he never said a word until after it was all over. And I can remember going into the port of Miami, and it had taken us forever to moor that poor ship because of the direction of the wind that day. And at the end of all of that, we finally got it to the dock. And then he finally calmly said, look, I might have done this or that. And I learned more from making mistakes that day than I ever learned from a classroom in ship handling.
And I think that's a strong message to senior managers, is that they have to stand behind their people. And I used to tell my folks that you have the responsibility, accountability, and authority to do what you need to get done, right? And if you mess up, I'm going to stand behind you. Just don't mess up too often, right? But you're right. You have to give people the flexibility that, you know, to be able to absorb a failure on occasion, you know, when you've thought out the direction you're going to take, right? And then come to recognize that, well, maybe I didn't think it out as much as I needed to. But, you know, in the port industry, we always, how many deals did we always try to put together? And they were never successful, you know, but, you know, what do? You dust yourself off and you move forward and stuff. So, well, Rick, this has been a very insightful, and I really appreciate it. You certainly, you know, are certainly one of the most distinguished people on our board, and we appreciate your insights and your help with all of the work that we've been trying to do. And we're very fortunate that we've had so many people worldwide who have taken our programs and have listened to my pontifications, you know, in the course of a study and stuff like that. And we do appreciate all the hard work that you've given us. And I certainly appreciate your time today. You know, it's always wonderful to be able to interact with you over the years. And you have been a mentor to me as well. So, and I very much appreciate all of the things that you have done and all the successes and the great example that you have set for the people who have worked for you, right? And the people that know you as well.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be on the board. I have an awful lot of respect for the organization that you've built and the value of it. And I hear it from all the people that I know that have gone through the program. Very sincerely, congratulations on what you're doing. Keep it up.
Well, thank you very much. And I understand you're also on the board of the Coast Guard Museum. How's that coming along?
It is. It's going to be built.
It's going to be built.
Doors will open in the spring of 2026. We're within a couple of $1 million of our goal from public support. We've gotten great support from the Connecticut congressional delegation and the city of New London. We're really excited about this, Jeff, and I can't wait to show people this educational, interactive museum. It's just going to be terrific.
Oh, I think it's going to be wonderful. Looking forward to it. I had the honor of being one of the captains on the lightship Nantucket, the 112.
Oh,
And when she came out of service and stuff was restored by the Mellon Foundation, and we ran her up and down the Maine coast, and now she's in Boston and being restored by a very dedicated group of lightship volunteers and stuff like that. So it's always nice to recognize the good work of the Coast Guard, and I'm very pleased that we've had a good interaction with the Coast Guard over the years, and that they have so much interest in our programs. So, Rick, I thank you very much, and I thank you very much for your time today, and look forward to continue to work with you on the board, and have a great and blessed week and weekend, and we'll talk to you again soon.
thanks, Jeff.